Hello everybody, and we welcome you once again to a lovely Friday, and with it a wonderful Friday Ramblings. And we're going to talk about something this week that is a last minute topic idea. As I was cruising around my favorite wrestling news website, I discovered that after a just shy of 2 years, it's about 22 months, so yeah, literally just shy of 2 years, from its latest ownership change, the NWA will begin airing a weekly television show, and that it is being recorded out of Atlanta, which is my neck of the woods. I'm a few hours south, but same state, and I have been to Atlanta many times, especially for wrestling stuff. Excuse me, people. A little dental issue here today. Drinky drink. Nice plastic cup, so can't have any accusations of sponsorships. You're right. Maybe if this topic was about awesome sodas, then we could be accused of sponsored content. But anyway, because of this awesome news, and specifically the fact that I know a lot of people out here are not going to necessarily recognize why it is awesome news, I thought I would just cover a brief history of what the NWA was, and why personally I'm glad to see it still existing in any form as a professional wrestling fan. First things first, I'm going to throw a few terminology here just to catch people up for those of you who are not professional wrestling folks at all. And that is, we refer to professional wrestling businesses. The three most common terms are companies, which is pretty much only used when you're discussing hard money. Promotions, which is what most people use nowadays especially. And territories, which is a by and large outdated term, simply because the territory system was something that the NWA really helped spawn. And since the NWA is in a position where it's not the company it was, it's not supporting the territory system anymore. As such, a lot of wrestling historians will refer to the old territory era being the decades of the 50s, 60s, 70s, and really up until about the mid-80s, I guess, where the territory system was strong and it was the main definition, or not definition, but the main way wrestling is organized and recognized here in America. So I'll kind of be throwing the different terms around, but that's the basics of what I mean. The NWA term is a shorthand for the National Wrestling Alliance. The reason I use the term alliance is very important because the NWA, as it originally existed, was set up as exactly that, a nationwide alliance of pre-existing wrestling promotions, which became the founding territories in the NWA. The idea was that the companies would happily and cheerily trade talent with each other, with the understanding that every territory stay out of each other's backyards. Essentially what happened is when the founding territories got together, they divided up the country. They said, okay, this is your territory, this is your territory, this is my territory, and so on and so on, with the understanding that another NWA member promotion will not compete in your territory. Thus, they are not actually competing with each other. Because this was the days before national television, at least on a professional wrestling basis. So, most wrestling was not even actually on TV. Some promotions might have local TV, but the local TV was not their prime money source. The prime money source was the live events. The TV was just a way to advertise the live event tours. So that's kind of backwards from where it is now. For instance, WWE makes the bulk of their money off the television deals they have and the pay-per-view buys. And of course the network, because now there's internet streaming, but we'll just consider that a form of television rights. They do still tour, which is mostly just a sense of tradition, and mostly because while they don't make a lot of money off live events, it is still a good way to just put a little bit of extra money in there. They do and WWE still does non-televised tapings, what are usually called house shows. That's, again, usually just to kind of supplementary income and get some of the stars that maybe aren't quite ready for prime time, as the phrase goes, some more practice in front of different live crowds where they can work on their gimmicks. But anyway, we're kind of diverging from there. The point of that was the point of the National Wrestling Alliance that was originally formed. Was several promotions dividing up the country and saying, if we all agree to play nice with each other and not directly compete with each other by running shows in the same towns, the same states, we will facilitate talent trading and therefore help everybody else's business, because that's the way professional wrestling ran for a long time, was that you would have a given star, we'll say the recently passed Harley Race, may he rest in peace, would work, say, in the Florida territory for a while, whether it be 6 months or 6 years, just depending on how much money he drew for the company and how big a star he was. And when fans were kind of like, okay, yeah, we've seen Harley Race wrestle everybody here a dozen times over, you know, yeah, it's starting to feel like summer reruns here. Harley would then go up to, say, the Carolinas, and he would compete there, where there was a fresh crop of talent and a fresh audience that had not seen Harley Race before, and so they were more than happy to pay money to see this Harley Race person that they've read about in magazines as being this guy who just spent time tearing it up in Florida. Now, this all started in 1948, which is why I say that the NWA and the territory system really picked up steam in the 50s, because it took a couple years to get everything worked out. One of the things the NWA also did over time was establish NWA championships. These were champions that, the main one being the NWA World Champion, World Men's Champion, but they didn't put the men's in at the time, because women's wrestling was not what it is today. We're not going to get into the gender politics. That is definitely a completely another episode. Probably be a long episode. Because, woo! You know, you start talking about women's wrestling, you gotta start talking about moolah, you gotta start talking about Mildred Burke. You start talking about the way women's wrestling was organized and that it was different from just standard men's singles and tag wrestling. Again, it's a very long subject. It's definitely going to be its own episode in the future. But as I said, the NWA eventually created their own championships to supplement each territory member's individual championships. Like, for instance, you would have the Florida heavyweight title, which was always in Florida. The guy's, going to leave, he would drop the Florida heavyweight championship to the next guy in line that's ready to be the champion. Simple system. But you would have the NWA champion who would be randomly picked from one of the promotions. There was an NWA, all the NWA territory owners, would get together every several months or so and would discuss business. And they would pick, they would decide if they were ready to change the world champion. But he would be a member of one of those rosters, and he would, more often than a standard wrestler, tour the different promotions as the recognized NWA World Champion, the champion of champions, essentially, where he would compete against all the local big-name talent. And the NWA did this for a long time. Give me just a second here, and I will actually, let's see. It was officially established at the beginning in 1948, the NWA World Heavyweight Championship. It is still in use today. We're going to touch on that in a moment. The original heavyweight champion is recognized as Orville Brown. He himself held the belt for about a year and some change before dropping it to Lou Thez, who is one of the biggest names in all of professional wrestling history. And he held it for 2,300 days, although there was a couple of disputed, alleged phantom title switches in between. But the point is that Lou Thez is the guy that, because he held that belt for, by the way, folks, if you don't want to do the math on that, 2,300 days is almost 7 years, about 6.5 years. Thez is generally considered the first major world champion, because he's the guy that, for year after year, really got the concept of the World Heavyweight Championship over. But that's the thing, and that was the basis of the NWA in its original form. Over time, more promotions would join, which you would join by paying a membership fee, and they would add in other championships, some of which would, over different years, they would eventually get a World Women's Championship, which again is very convoluted. We're going to get into that when we discuss the history of women's wrestling. They came up with a World Light Heavyweight Championship. It was not really a major title. It was mostly promoted off television. There was a World Tag Team Championship, though that was not formally created until 1992. When they got into some fun with WCW. Before that, each territory would have their own tag team championship that they would refer to as the NWA whatever tag team championship based on whatever region they were in. Like you would have the NWA Florida Tag Team Championship. You would have the NWA West Coast Tag Team Championship. So that's the thing. The NWA never really had a lot of championships because they were meant as supplementals to the territories. Their champions were the primaries. This was just a way to further have the territories help each other's business by creating one star who was so legendary in his time by being put on a scale above every other champion in the NWA, that him showing up to town pretty much guaranteed sellouts. Which is why the NWA executive board was always very careful about choosing who would be the champions and when they would switch the championship. Ooh, pardon me, that's what you get for sipping soda. So eventually the NWA would actually gain membership outside of the continental U.S. You would have let me see here. I just want to make sure I get these promotion names right so I don't insult anything. CMLL was the primary NWA member in Mexico, although that when they joined, they were under their original name of EMLL. Down in the Caribbean, there was the World Wrestling Council, which is based out of Puerto Rico. And the NWA also had representation in Japan, originally with JWA, the Japan Pro Wrestling Alliance. Yes, I do have notes here I'm reading from, folks, because there's a lot of names I'm throwing out here, back and forth. Later, the JWA would splinter and break down and disappear, and we would have All Japan Pro Wrestling and New Japan Pro Wrestling be formed. These companies are still in existence today, and New Japan and All Japan have both been NWA members at different times. Which did result in the NWA World Champion wrestling in Japan and being occasionally a form of contention between All Japan and New Japan as they competed to be the top Japanese promotion. These days, top Japanese promotions pretty much universally agreed to be New Japan, as All Japan has had some problems over the years, especially from a sorry about a little shake there, from a promotional standpoint, office leadership. But anyway, everything was great with this system. The WWF, or WWE, formerly known as WWF, originally known as WWF, was actually a member of the NWA off and on. The current Vince McMahon, Vince McMahon everybody knows about, his father, Vince McMahon Sr., was often a member of the NWA in good standing. It was when Vince took over and started the national expansion and Hulkamania in the 80s that WWF pretty much splintered away from the NWA for good, and they became major competitors to each other. Later, the AWA, which was actually one of the original promotions to join, would splinter off, feeling that it had now built itself up big enough and had its own TV deals in a wide enough area that it did not need the advantages of being in the NWA. WCCW, World Class Championship Wrestling in Texas, would later splinter off as well for the same basic logic reasons. This would be the era where the NWA started weakening as a concept because it was competing with the WWF as the recognized name in wrestling, and losing the AWA and World Class and gaining, and thus having smaller but still significant rivalries with them, did not help. The end of the classic NWA era is pretty much unofficially considered to be, although I don't think a lot of people dispute it, but I'm not claiming anything official because I'm not a major wrestling historian. But essentially, the end of the original NWA would occur when Georgia Championship Wrestling, later known as World Championship Wrestling, aka WCW, which operated out of Atlanta, decided to pull out of the NWA. The major problem being, at this point, they were by and large the largest member in the NWA after WWF, AWA, and World Class had all left, and some of the old original founding promotions had died off and gone out of business, trying to compete with the WWF. So not only did WCW have the most widest territory, which by this point also included, besides Georgia, hence part of why they renamed it WCW, that and the national television deal they had on TBS. But they had also absorbed the old Carolinas and Florida territories. And I think part of Tennessee. I would have to consult so much wiser wrestling promoters about that. But either way, they had a major chunk of the East Coast and a national television deal. They also had all the major wrestling stars that were in WWF, and as such, had control of the NWA World Heavyweight Championship. And in fact, that World Tag Team Championship that was formed in 1992 was originally used almost exclusively on WCW TV. So when that happened, when WCW cut all ties to the NWA, they now had two major promotions with massive national TV deals on major networks competing with them. They lost all their big stars, and they had to vacate their championships, which is never good for wrestling business because you create the idea of a paper champion when somebody wins a vacated title. That's why, as I said earlier, although Orville Brown is the officially recognized original NWA World Champion, Lou Thesz is often credited as the guy that made the World Championship matter because he beat a guy who had been champion for a couple years and been defending it and went on a dominant several years reign. The NWA had one last scheme, though. They had a company operating out of Philadelphia called Eastern Championship Wrestling that was gaining a major cult following, was really taking advantage of the old tape trading system and word-of-mouth campaigning. And so the NWA, they held a tournament, crowned a new world champion. And they were going to put major Eastern Championship Wrestling star Shane Douglas over as the tournament winner and the new world champion. It was going to be a new rebirth era. Except Eastern Championship Wrestling had recently been taken over by Paul Heyman. And Paul Heyman had a grander vision. Paul Heyman wanted to appeal to the youth market, which is why he was gaining this cult following. And part of the youth market in the mid-90s is a rebellious spirit. Which means their main star did not want to hold what is recognized as the oldest current wrestling championship and represent an organization that was all about wrestling tradition. So minutes after winning the World Championship, Shane Douglas threw it on the ground, cut a vicious promo bearing the NWA and its legends, such as Harley Race and Dusty Rhodes, grabbed up the Eastern Championship Heavyweight Championship, declared it the new Extreme Championship Wrestling World Championship, and they withdrew from the NWA as well. This was a major black mark to the company's reputation, that a promotion that at that time did not even have a national television deal, did not have the major backing of big money like WCW had with Ted Turner, and Vince McMahon having built his own fortune off the backs of Hulkamania, and the other big stars of the era like Macho Man, but the Hulkamania era with the early WrestleManias and pay-per-view. You know, the wrestling industry fandom kind of looked at the NWA and said, dude, that's it. Like, that's your sign. Nobody that has an audience wants to be affiliated with you guys. You're old-fashioned. You're fossils. And in a lot of ways, that was the death knell for the NWA. It did continue to exist. Wrestling manager and newly minted wrestling promoter Jim Cornette and his Smoky Mountain Wrestling later hosted another tournament to crown the once again vacated championship and put it around the waist of their young talent, future big star Chris Candido, may he rest in peace, who did his best, didn't hold the belt for super long, but, you know, he did what he could. Throughout the 90s and the O's, the NWA was in a period where basically it was there, but none of the territories really had a big enough presence in the wrestling fan base to establish proper street cred and put that new shine on the NWA that it really needed. To the point that the NWA actually made a deal to have their championships seen on WWE television in an angle where several NWA iconic talent was brought in by Jim Cornette, again, trying to help out the NWA because he was an old school wrestling fan and he loved the tradition and concept of the NWA, as a wrestling stable whose traditional values were opposing the WWE's then newly forming Attitude Era. And while the group didn't look great on WWE television, the national TV exposure saved the NWA from bankruptcy. And I'm not exaggerating here, this is actual quotes from then NWA president Howard Brody. He did an excellent podcast interview a few years ago with Jim Cornette on his Jim Cornette Experience podcast. If you do want to hear the minute details of just how bad off the NWA was financially at this point and how low their membership was, I think he said there was only like 5 promotions that had official membership. Go look it up. It's online. You can find individual clips on the official Jim Cornette YouTube channel. There's one called the official Jim Cornette, and then there's the Arcadian Vanguard, which is run by his co-host Brian Last. But there's clips up there where from the interview if you don't want to listen to the entire podcast. But that's the thing, is WWE basically saved the NWA from going out of business. The NWA would later work with Jeff Jarrett, who was a second-generation promoter. His father, Jerry Jarrett, promoted in Tennessee as a long-standing NWA member. But Jerry Jarrett's new company, Total Nonstop Action, aka TNA, I know, TNA, it's a pun for T and A. We're not getting into that one. But they got themselves a pretty decent TV deal and a lot of attention as the former WCW wrestlers that WWE did not pick up for varying reasons formed the backbone of the initial TNA roster, including Jeff Jarrett himself, who was also an on-air talent besides being the promoter. TNA was the major NWA member for a while, had control of the World Championship and the Tag Team Championship. I'm not sure about the Women's Championship. Give me just a second here, folks. I'm going to go look up who would have been the World Women's Champion at the time. Let's see. I don't think they would have. Don't recall if they actually used it. I think. Okay, yes, they did. They did early on use the World Women's Championship. It was not heavily featured on TNA. They didn't promote a lot of women's wrestling in the early years. When they did, they formed their own championship because this was shortly after the NWA. And again, this is according to Howard Brody, then NWA executive. Actually, the NWA decided to break off from TNA as they gained some new territories, and those promotions felt they did not need TNA's TV exposure. That was mind-blowing. Like, literally, for several years, most people assumed TNA withdrew from the NWA because they felt they got too big. Hearing that the NWA felt they didn't need TNA was mind-blowing and a little bit insane. To the point that when Howard Brody told this to, in the interview, that, I mean, it was an absolute, like, stop the show, wait, rewind, make sure I heard you right moment, because that did not actually help end the NWA at all. Howard Brody was not the president at the time. He didn't make the decision. But, yeah, it was the thing. Now, this brings us into the latest era of the NWA, which is 2012, when the NWA was transferred to R. Bruce Tharpe and his International Wrestling Corps company as a result of a lawsuit filed against then executive director Robert Trobisch, which had controlled all the name, championship, ownership, trademarks, yada yada, on behalf of the organization. The NWA, under Howard Brody, in the 90s, had tweaked its legal business recognition from a for-profit company that was collecting membership dues to a non-profit, I want to say LLC. I'm not sure if LLC would be the right term here, but the idea is they went from a profit-based business to a non-profit, and as such, literally could not directly own the trademarks because then you would be collecting money from people who wanted to use your championships in the NWA name, but you're a non-profit, so you can't do that. Again, it was one of those things Howard Brody did to keep the company afloat during those few years until they could get memberships in and get recognition from the wrestling fan base again. But the long and short of it is R. Bruce Tharpe took over ownership of the NWA trademarks, the intellectual property as it's often called now, IP. Under Tharpe, the NWA changed from a membership-based governing body to a private organization which licensed the NWA name to promotions. And he did this for about 5 years until, on October 1st, 2017, Billy Corgan of Smashing Pumpkins and fame, as in the musical band, not a guy running around destroying pumpkins, that would really kind of be like pushing on that old stand-up comedian Gallagher's thing, and I mean, he did watermelons, but he did a lot of stuff. Yeah, my mind's drifting. But yes, Billy Corgan, who had been working with TNA previously, had a falling out with Dixie Carter because Dixie Carter, and again, I've never met her personally, I'm not speaking of her as an individual in a social sense, But there's a lot of documentation over TNA Impact's history that shows Dixie Carter, when it comes to business, is a carny con artist. Billy Corgan got tired of dealing with her and her two-faced way of doing business, so he just walked away from TNA Impact, took his money, and purchased the NWA. At which point his first act was to let the current affiliate agreements lapse, and over these last 2 years, he has been rebuilding the NWA by having championship matches on different events affiliated with different major promotions. He's put on a couple NWA specific events. He did a major anniversary show. And now, as I said at the beginning of the show, he's getting ready to launch a NWA based weekly wrestling television show, which is, if everything works out good, going to give the NWA major name recognition, allow them to promote matches under the NWA banner with the current NWA champions, which will hopefully allow the NWA to regrow. Closing minutes here, folks. I appreciate you sitting through all this. I know history in and of itself can be a little boring, but the reason we have to discuss all this is to get to my point of now. Why I am happy to see Billy Corgan is trying to launch a weekly wrestling television show for the NWA. Why, no matter how much it's struggled, no matter how much prestige has been lost over awkward years and the snubbing of having people voluntarily leave your organization because they don't need you anymore, why I want the NWA to stay around as a concept, and why I would love to see it come back to the point that the NWA champion would be somebody that could show up in major promotions like Ring of Honor, like AEW, like New Japan, like EMLL, or All Japan, or AAA, any other wrestling company that is financially stable in and of itself. The old TNA Impact, which is now just straight Impact, they dropped TNA a while back. But because the NWA is tradition, and in professional wrestling, tradition is everything. Wrestling championships make money for wrestling companies because of prestige, of holding the championship, being recognized as the best of this group. But a championship's prestige is based on its past. The people that have won it before, the awesome wrestling matches they have put on as champion. You know, currently the WWE Championship, which is held by Kofi Kingston, is considered a highly prestigious championship to hold, not just because the WWE is the biggest wrestling company on the planet and you'll get a big paycheck being their major champion, but because when you look at that championship, you think of Shawn Michaels, you think of The Rock, you think of Stone Cold Steve Austin, you think of Bret Hart, you think of Macho Man Randy Savage, you think of Hulk Hogan, you think of, if you're, really older fan, or you've been watching the major archival footage on the network, you think of Bruno Sammartino. Because let's be honest, I don't care what anybody says, you cannot discuss wrestling history without discussing Bruno Sammartino. And it's the same thing with the NWA Championship. The NWA Championship has been held by the Nature Boy Ric Flair. It has been held by Harley Race. It has been held by Dusty Rhodes. It has been held by, everybody. outside of WWE post Hogan major, created stars. In the modern era, you have people like, through the TNA deal especially, you have people like AJ Styles and Sting. Actually, I think Sting might have held the NWA under the old WCW before the split, but he held it again in TNA. But you have people like AJ Styles in the more modern era. And AJ Styles is recognized pretty much across the entire world, thanks to a run in New Japan, as one of the greatest wrestling talents we have running today. Currently, the NWA World Champion is a gentleman by the name of Nick Aldis, who, if you did watch TNA Impact in previous years, competed under Magnus. And he's been doing an incredible job of representing it. He's very proud of it. But it's not even just the World Heavyweight Championship. You have, as I said, things like the Tag Team Championship, which is relatively more recent, as it was only formed in 1992, but throughout its early years, it was held by some of the biggest tag teams in wrestling outside of the WWE. It's just, that is what wrestling is based off of. Professional wrestling has to have championships, because that is, at the end of the day, in storyline, what people are competing for. The right to be recognized as the best. Well, how are you recognized as the best? Well, because you're the champion. Well, why does a championship make you the best? Because of who has held it before you. People that literally beat everybody else that stepped in the ring with. So you cannot have pro wrestling without history, without tradition. And the NWA is tradition. So it should have prestige in the perception of the fans. And we need that history. As wrestling fans, we need our history. We need something to look at and say, I am part of something that goes back to the turn of this century. Not this century, the previous century. Think about it. Professional wrestling as a concept goes back to the early 1900s. How can you not want to be part of something that epic? Something that long-standing in American culture. Professional wrestling is Americana. And it's international. As I say, Mexico, Japan, Canada, Europe. Hell, there are wrestling promotions in Africa. So, if anybody that is watching this video, whether you're watching it when it newly debuts or you watch it a year or more after it goes up on YouTube, research the NWA for yourself. Go find old footage of NWA championship matches. See what I'm talking about for yourself. Feel the awesomeness of it. And hopefully a year from now, Billy Corgan and the NWA will still be running hard. And it'll be bigger than it has been for a while now. I love that the WWE Network has archive footage from many, many wrestling promotions, because they have purchased the tape libraries from defunct promotions. I love that they are striving to be something that encompasses so much more than just the WWE's history. If you go back and watch my old Hall of Fame video I did back in April, I talk about their legacy wing, where they induct wrestlers from the original era of pro wrestling here in America in those early decades, some of whom were competing before the WWF was a thing. But you can't just have one company in control of all of history. You can't have just one company with that prestige that history gives you. So support the National Wrestling Alliance if you're a pro wrestling fan. Definitely study it. Look at the history of it. See all the different promotions that, as NWA members, put on matches that decades later are still studied by wrestling talent who wants to learn how to be proper professional wrestlers. And ultimately, hey, come back next week. We're going to talk about other stuff. Probably not wrestling. I do like to vary things up. But as I said, I will one day discuss the long, convoluted history of women's wrestling in North America, and especially when it comes to the different championships, because there's a lot of backstage politics involved in that. I'm going to need my own hour, which is I've hit over 45 minutes, folks, and I appreciate you staying with me this long. I really do. I know these videos are long and people like short and sweet stuff, but there's so much to discuss in these things. I can't just talk about it for 10 minutes at a time. I don't know. Maybe I need to split these up into multiple parts. If you sat through these videos, please comment about it. Tell me if you would rather that I do, multi-part videos that are like 10, 15 minutes each and upload them throughout the week. Tell me if you prefer these long sit-down lecture videos. I'm trying to make this so everybody enjoys. That's why I always say at the end, have constructive criticism instead of just straight up hatred. Just be a good person, carry that good spirit and good intent with you throughout your daily life. Come back next time. We'll have some stuff to discuss. I do occasionally get critical, but I try to make it always constructive criticism, something that can move things forward. But please, whether it's pro wrestling, whether it's comics, whether it's video games, whether it's television, whether it's movies, whether it's just good old-fashioned books. Look, I have so many of over here. And the comic books back there. Well, that's your traditional novels over there. That's the manga over there. But however you get your entertainment. Music. Let's not forget music. It's my little MP3 player. It's full of music from different decades, different genres. Enjoy your entertainment. Let it enrich your life. Seek great entertainment. And please come back next time, because I do enjoy talking to you. I do enjoy hanging out with you for however long I ramble on. Have a great weekend. This has been your Friday Dose of David.